Hi, everybody. Buenos noches y bienvenidos to my talk. It is wonderful to be here. I have to say the people who host this event in PG County deserve a major shout out. They are like the friendliest and kindest people. And of course, they're staying up late many nights to make sure that we get this information out there to people. One thing before we get started is you will find that these slides have kind of an empty space in the lower right-hand corner. So if you can put the face panels over in the lower right-hand corner, you really don't need to look at me. I'm just going to look like a middle-aged woman the whole time. So if you want to see the slides clearly, go ahead and pop those little faces over to the side so that they are out of your way. So I'm talking tonight about dyslexia, but I'm also talking about dyslexia prevention as well as dyslexia remediation. A lot of the cases of dyslexia that we see in my line of work, which is neuropsych testing, situations where it didn't need to be as bad as it wound up being. I come from a family where there are 4 people in the family who have dyslexia. Somehow I snuck by with the genetic lottery where I did not get dyslexia, but this is a topic, again, that is really near and dear to my heart. And I so appreciate the folks at Prince George's County Public Schools. Thank you having me here to talk about it. Okay, so if you are here, please mute yourself. Otherwise, we're going to hear all your business, your fights with your husband, your dog, everything you're chewing. So go ahead and put yourself on mute. Put the pictures in the lower right-hand corner and buckle up. We have a lot to talk about. Let's see if I can advance the slides. That'd be nice. So my slides are not advancing. That's always fun. Let's see if I can get the computer in here. Nope. Any ideas, Marcy, what I'm doing wrong?
So are you in PowerPoint or are you in Google Slides?
Unfortunately, I'm still in PowerPoint for this talk. Haven't shifted it over yet.
Okay, there should be in the upper left.
Okay.
Stop the slide presentation.
Stop it.
Actually, it's in the lower left. So if you scroll all the way down to the
yeah.
lower
Oh,
left,
there we go.
yeah,
Okay. Is everybody impressed so far with this? There we go. Okay. So here's the state of where we are now in this country. In 2019, the percentage of 4th grade, oops, sorry, I've got all sorts of stuff popping up on my screen. I'm just going to get rid of that. In 2019, the percentage of 4th grade public school students performing at or above the National Association of Education's proficient level in reading was 34% nationally. So even before the pandemic, that means that about 2/3 of the population of kids out there in 4th grade had not achieved even proficient level in reading. Here's another statement of the problem. 20% of 15-year-olds don't attain a level of reading performance that allows them to participate effectively in life. We all know that our society, in terms of information, media, how do we learn new things, how do we gain new skills, get new jobs, our society is getting more and more complex all the time. The problem that we have for a lot of folks is the problem of low literacy. We do pretty well with getting people to some degree of literacy, but what we don't have is real proficiency, where all the people in this country have access to the level of literacy that allows them to pursue job training or higher education, to read a contract if they get offered a job, to read a lease, to read the prescription inserts in their medication, to read the safety instructions when they buy a new device. So the impact of low literacy, of people who can just sort of kind of read, really can't be overstated. It's a huge social justice issue, and it is a very serious problem. Okay, advance now. All right, you can see I'm a Simpsons fan. If you can't read this, it says parent teacher night, let's share the blame. Having been a special educator, one of the things that I found was that a lot of the things I had learned, once I got out into the classroom, didn't work. And it was very frustrating because here I had spent 6 years of my life getting this skill set, a lot of money, a lot of sacrifice went towards this, a lot of passion. And when I got out there, the stuff I had been taught to do just plain old didn't work. Emily Hansen, the dyslexia specialist, has this great quote that I'll share with you. It says, "Scientific research has shown how children learn to read and how they should be taught. But many educators don't know the science and in some cases actively resist it. As a result, millions of kids are being set up to fail." And this is kids in communities all over the country, in marginalized communities, especially the effects of systemic racism and teacher shortages in places where the kids have the highest level of need. This is a problem that's gone on for a long time. Let me take you to that first sentence. Scientific research has shown how children learn to read and how they should be taught. Guess when we knew this? We considered this settled science, as in all the research points us in one direction, that we need to use evidence-based, phonics-based reading instruction. This was known in 1983. I'm 49 years old, about to turn 50. This is a long time ago. One thing I want you to pay attention to as I give this talk is about how old a lot of the dates are that I'm going to mention. We have known since 1983 what we need to do to set kids up for success and make sure that kids don't come out of school with low literacy, that they come out with proficient literacy, no matter who they are, no matter where they grow up, whether they're in a marginalized community or Chevy Chase, Maryland. Every kid should have the access to evidence-based reading instruction, the things that we know actually work. So why aren't they getting it? Let me take you back to a magical time called the 90s. And let me see if I can shift my slides. Oh, goodness, there we go. Okay. So I went to school at the University of Maryland. I did like all of my training except for 1 year in Prince George's County Public Schools. Thank you to all those teachers who mentored us students when we had absolutely no idea what we were doing and were probably taking as much of their time as the kids were. Back in the middle of the 90s, there was the whole language movement. So I got my degree in 1995, 96 for the master's. And what I was taught was that we were doing kids a really serious wrong, that we were doing them harm by teaching them phonics. What we were taught was that we needed to stop this sort of reductionistic way of teaching, such that you teach kids to like decode and sound words out and understand the letter sound relationships. That's what I mean by phonics, that you systematically teach them how to decode written language. And so despite that being settled science, remember 1983, this movement came to start teaching children to read the way that children learn to acquire spoken language. The impetus behind the whole language movement was really very noble and very good. It was all about, let's expose all children to really rich, wonderful experiences of literacy so that every child can access, the magic of stories and literature and read thought-provoking things. Okay, I like that. That's good. And when I was 21-year-old back in 1996, social justice-minded little lady, I was like, this is the way to go. This is the future. Well, the problem is that the whole language movement was based on some ideology and some assumptions, but it was not based on evidence. It was not based on the science of how the human brain works. So the assumptions of whole language were that reading develops in response to meaningful literature, and that students, instead of being taught how to decode language, would be taught to guess at words, and that they would somehow magically absorb the words in exposure to wonderful stories. The idea was that words would be memorized as whole units with enough exposure for both spelling and for writing, and that teachers would serve as facilitators. So the teachers were not going to teach kids how to read. I can't emphasize this enough. What I was taught back in the 90s, and I know that 2 generations of teachers were taught the same way, and I'm imagining some of you are like nodding your heads. We were taught that you shouldn't be teaching kids how to read. You should be guiding them through these experiences just the way that kids are taught how to speak spoken language or sign. They're taught through exposure. And the teacher is not a teacher, the teacher is a facilitator. There's a couple things about whole language that are really relevant to dyslexia that I want to bring your attention to. So if you look at these three circles, when kids are taught reading through whole language, they're taught the 3 cueing method. And what the 3 cueing method is it's teaching kids a systematic way of guessing. So what this means is when kids get to text and they come to a word that they don't know how to read, well, of course, we're not teaching them how to read, that they would use these ways of guessing. So they would guess based on either the semantic clues, what the word means using their background knowledge. They would look at how the word looks, not decode it, but look at how it looks, and that they would guess based on their understanding of how English grammar works. So that's where an entire generation of educators was taught. This is how we thought about this. Now, who cares, right? This was back in the 90s. The important thing to know about this is that the people who were brought up during the whole language movement are now the people who are in positions of authority. Those of us who learned whole language are now the administrators. We are the principals. We're the ones who develop curriculum. We're the ones who decide what curriculum to buy. We're the ones that mentor young teachers coming up through the ranks. So I can't overstate the importance that we have a whole generation and more of teachers who were taught to teach reading in a way that really doesn't match the evidence and what we know about the human brain. So our problem is not just dyslexia, it is a more systematic problem that we have in our field. And one could even call it shiny object syndrome, where we sort of bounce from idea to idea. But let's get back to what matters for your kids and your students. So what happened? We had the phonics movement that was, in style up until the 80s, and then we had the 90s with whole language. Well, what happened was what we called the reading wars. And the outcome of that was that we got sort of a compromise position called balanced literacy. So balanced literacy meant that most of what we're doing in the classroom is still whole language, but we're going to do a little phonics here and there, and maybe some phonics for the kids who are really struggling readers. So the problem with balanced literacy is, for one thing, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff still that really isn't evidence-based, and we're shortchanging the stuff that actually works. And Dr. Kathy Brassel of the University of London, fabulous researcher, she's put it better than I can. She said, meaning-focused balanced literacy or multi-cueing type teaching risks wasting limited instructional time and undermining phonic learning. So the problem is when we teach kids to guess instead of teaching them to decode, we're actually teaching them to read like struggling readers, because struggling readers guess, proficient readers decode. There's 3 big ideas to know tonight when you understand what's going wrong when a kid has dyslexia. One thing that's really important is that reading requires intensive instruction. It does not happen if the teacher is serving as facilitator. The teacher needs to be activator. The teacher needs to do a lot of teaching. Reading instruction rewires the brain. This is not just something we say to teachers like, I touch the future I teach, or world's greatest teacher on a coffee cup. This is literal. This is brain science. Reading instruction rewires the brain. For a lot of our kids who are identified as potentially having dyslexia or who are behind in reading is because for some reason their brain is not rewiring the way that most kids' brain rewire. And it might be that they never really had the opportunity to get that intensive regular instruction from a skilled teacher. The other thing to know, reading disorders are common, that they appear in about 10 to 15% of the population. That is a huge number of kids. There are kids all over the place who are struggling with reading. And the great thing is that most of the time, this is treatable. It's also preventable. And that's where we're going next. Dr. Marianne Wolf up at Tufts University has this great quote that I want you to keep in mind. Reading never just happens to anyone. You'll hear every now and then that some kids sort of crack the code on their own. Most of the time that's happening because they had a parent or mentor or grandparent who sort of gave them just enough to get them started and got the ball rolling, and then they were sort of naturally precocious. But in the vast majority of cases, reading never just happens to anyone. We don't learn to read the way we learn to speak, which is just exposure to our native language. Back in 1997, again, this is an old date. This is back when I was young and didn't dye my hair yet, okay? 1997, the National Reading Panel came out with a massive review of the research, and it talked about, in this report, it talked about what are the essential components of reading? What do kids actually need to be able to do? And when we think about reading instruction, these 4 things are, if you'll forgive me for saying it this way, this is the rock upon which we're going to build our church. You got to have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary, and all of it has to be deliberately taught. By the end of this presentation, you are going to know what all of those terms mean, and you are going to know more than I knew when I had my master's degree in special education. Remember I said that reading rewires the brain, and that for reading to happen, it doesn't just happen. Reading requires a lot of intensive instruction from an activator, a teacher, not a facilitator. I'm a big Simone Biles fan, and she has this great quote, "Practice makes confidence, confidence empowers you." The brain only rewires if it receives intense, regular stimulation with error correction. Again, teachers must be activators, not facilitators. The thing to know about the human brain is that our brains evolved throughout human history during an era where most people did not have enough to eat. Our brain is calorically very expensive. It's full of fat, essentially. Your brain is like made of fat and protein, pretty much the same stuff in soup stock, salt, potassium. And because the brain is always used to not having enough, the brain becomes very efficient about deciding what it's going to invest resources in. So human brains don't rewire unless it's given a really good reason. And that really good reason to rewire is intense, regular stimulation with error correction. So again, we need activators, not facilitators. Okay, now we're getting into some of the neurobiology of dyslexia. Please don't worry, I'm going to make all of this very clear. I'm going to put on my special ed hat and make this very accessible. So here's basically what happens when a brain goes from an illiterate brain to a brain that can read. What happens is that the centers of the brain that are sensitive to visual information, these centers all the way in the back. If you look at this little brain, the pointy part on the right-hand side, that's the back of your brain, the part of your brain that processes visual information. Text is visual information. It comes in through your retina, it travels back through your optic nerves, it gets to the back of your brain, switch sides, get to the back of your brain, and this visual information comes in. Okay, now, in the front of your brain, over here, if you see towards the front, you got areas like 45 and 38. This is where your brain is processing speech. So if you notice, the part of the brain that's processing visual input is all the way in the back. The part that's processing speech is pretty much all the way in the front. Well, what do you do if you need to get information from text, visual information from the back of the brain all the way up to the front part where the brain can make sense of language? You need to build an information superhighway. You need to build an absolutely new bridge between these brain areas that nature never intended. And the way the brain does that, again, it doesn't do it unless it gets a lot of intensive instruction. And that intensive instruction needs to convince this brain to process visual information from text in the exact same way that it processes auditory language that comes in through the ears. This will make sense to you if you think about it this way. If you see a sign that says danger 5,000 volts, your brain should process that information exactly the same way as if I said to you, you're about to touch a wire and I said, danger 5,000 volts. Your brain can get that exact meaning from either the text on the page, the visual information or the language-based auditory information that comes in. And why? Because the brain is creating that information superhighway between these two areas. For dyslexic kids, it's that information superhighway that gets all the information exactly where it needs to go at exactly the right time, that either doesn't build properly or doesn't even build at all. Brains recycle and repurpose. The brain is cheap and lazy and used to operating on a shoestring budget. Like I said, most of humanity came up without having enough to eat. So brains have to be very efficient. Brains also have very limited real estate. We got a skull, right? And there's limits to how, sorry, somebody's spamming me. Go away, spammer. And there's limits to how much your brain can really build and for you still to be able to be born, because your skull can only be so big. So what has to happen is that your brain has to take the speech and language centers, those sort of hardwired structures that we're kind of born with. They are sensitized and ready as soon as we're exposed to our native language, whether it's a spoken language or a sign language. All languages, all the same, the brain processes them exactly the same way. And our brain has to take all of those circuits that were designed for spoken language and connect them up with the visual area. So culture imparts rewiring on the human brain. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so remember I said that teachers rewire the brain. Again, this is not just something to put on a coffee cup. This is literally true. So again, the back of the brain is all the way on the right-hand side. You can see that blue dot says visual input. So this is where the visual information comes in towards the back and gets processed so that you can make some sense of it. Are you looking at a cat or a chocolate chip cookie? Now, if you look at this, you can see this is an illustration of these reading circuits, this information superhighway that gets built in response to evidence-based effective instruction. We got two streams that take that information from the visual part of the brain and bring it up to the language part of the brain, and then all the way up to the front part of the brain where we can make judgments about it and understand it and connect up ideas and have emotional reactions. So one thing to pay attention to is that red dot right there. That is referred to as the visual word form area. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz, way back in the early 90s, again, we're talking decades ago, identified this area as the area that is not functioning optimally when somebody has dyslexia. What this area is a hub. It's an area that takes the visual information from text and connects it up with the language circuits of the brain. So if this hub doesn't develop properly or doesn't have really strong connections between other parts of the brain, or maybe isn't really wired all that well itself, this is when we get dyslexia. That little red dot is like the key to fluid reading and fluid comprehension. I put this up because I want to make a point about how brains excel at making predictions. So when I put this up, some people cringe, and those of us who are a little bit evil, we laugh. The reason that this is funny and remarkable is because our brains are so good at making predictions. Brains have to be. We are very efficient. Remember, brains cheap, lazy, used to operating on a shoestring budget when most of humanity was starving. Brains had to get really good at making predictions. And how do we get good at making predictions? Well, you all know a lot about porta potties and bridges and driving and the basic laws of physics, which is for every action there will be an equal and opposite reaction. So nobody here had to look at this and wonder, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? No, your brains are so good at recognizing patterns that you recognize this instantly. Okay. Remember I said that teachers have to be activators, not facilitators. When I said activators, the first job of a teacher who's teaching kids how to read is that they have to start sensitizing kids to patterns. Let's practice that a little bit. And let me tell you what I mean. If you haven't seen this before, you're probably scanning this all over, looking all around with your eyes, trying to find some kind of meaning in it. But once I tell you that this is a picture of a Dalmatian, it's facing away from you and it's walking towards a tree. And what you can see on the right-hand side is that the tree has a big black shadow on the ground. Once I say this to you and sensitize you to the pattern, you can't unsee it. If I showed this to you 2 years from now, you would still immediately recognize that's a dog walking towards a tree, because brains are amazing. More about pattern recognition. Remember, a good teacher is teaching kids how to recognize patterns. That's how brains get good at predicting, and that's how we remember things. Brains don't remember information that doesn't have any meaning. So we sensitize kids to patterns all the time. Why should phonics be any different? If you're somebody who plays chess, for example, you immediately recognize that this pattern is check over on the left-hand side. In the middle, if you read music, you know that I just rickrolled everyone in this room. If you have teenagers, you're probably familiar with the expression of rickrolling, which is where they play this really bad pop song at you during unexpected moments of the day. I have teenagers. And then on the right-hand side, here's another pattern that most of us have been sensitized to, especially if you grew up in the DMV area, right? And that is leaves of 3, let it be. Everybody knows how to recognize poison ivy among all the other green plants that we see. We know this because we're sensitized to patterns. And so when we go out into the forest, poison ivy jumps right out at us. We're very good at this. If something has meaning and a pattern, that is when the brain gets all excited and starts investing in, hey, this is important, interesting information. Let's invest in an information superhighway. Let's make sure we don't lose this. Now we're going to bring that back to reading, what I just taught you about the brain. The important thing to know about reading is something that was discovered in 1986. Again, 1986. This is the simple view of reading. What this basically means is that for reading comprehension to happen, there are 2 essential things that must be present. There must be the capacity for decoding. Decoding means breaking up words into their phonemes, and those are the unique speech sounds that are represented in words. That ability to transform print into spoken language. Remember, that ability to take your visual information processing system, connect it up with the speech language centers, and get meaning in the front of your brain. We also have to have language comprehension. We have a lot of kids, especially in the DMV area, it's wonderful diversity here, but we have a lot of kids who are maybe bilingual and maybe not English dominant, or maybe they're learning English for the first time. Those poor critters, they come right over, from another country, they're thrown right into an ESOL class. We also have a lot of language diversity in this area, and it's really important for us as teachers and educators and psychologists. We need to get rid of this very bigoted idea that there's like one proper way to speak, or that one variation of English is like the right one, that everyone in the world has to talk like Tom Brokaw or the Queen of England. It's just not true. There's every bit as much validity and rules governing and patterns to what we refer to as African American vernacular. I know that there's some changes in that some people are referring to it now as Black vernacular. Forgive me if I got it wrong, but I do want to emphasize that just because a kid comes into our classroom speaking differently, we are not going to say that that kid is wrong. But there has to be language comprehension. If we're trying, for example, to teach a kid who is really still pretty shaky with English, they might learn some decoding, but they're still going to be working very, very hard to read a complicated English text, especially if they haven't lived in this country for very long, or they haven't had the chance to have a lot of different experiences. For example, if they were, recently resettled refugees. If you like more complexity, this is Scarborough's reading rope. So this is basically the same thing as the simple view of reading, but made more complicated. So if you like the complicated view of reading, go ahead and Google Scarborough's reading rope. Again, this is from 2001. This is not new, okay? This is 20 years ago. But reading, the point of this is to know that reading is a multifaceted skill, and it is gradually acquired over years of instruction and practice. So our kids who are dyslexic, they're usually not struggling with language comprehension. They are usually struggling with the word recognition and the decoding piece. That is sort of one of the pieces that we pay a lot of attention to in identifying dyslexia, is that we want to find out that the source of reading problems really isn't that the child is either learning a new language or that they are really struggling with an mixed expressive and receptive language disorder, and that's really the underlying problem there. So this is why testing and screening. Maryland now has a mandated dyslexia screening law. I think it's fantastic. We need to understand the source of the reading problems, because dyslexia is really not about language comprehension problems. It's really much more about that decoding, that information superhighway, getting the visual information from words up to the speech and language centers so we can process it. One thing I really want to emphasize is something that is counter to what I learned back in the 90s, and that is that reading is not a visual memory task. We don't learn to read by memorizing the visual input of sight words. Let me tell you what I mean. When you have sight word wall up in your room, or you give kids, sorry, I'm talking for teachers now, go to your kids' classroom and look at the sight word wall, or ask your kid, what are your sight words you're working on? What vocabulary word, or sorry, what sight words do you have in your flashcards or your game that you're working on, practicing on the computer? The problem is we teach reading as if just looking at the words and memorizing how they look is going to help us learn to read. That's left over from whole language. Sight words, just memorizing how they look, does not teach kids how to read. Remember, the simple view of reading was all about decoding and language comprehension. There's nothing there about memorizing the look of words. So all of those Dick and Jane books from back in the 1950s, they were going on the principle that reading is a visual memory task. And if you just see look Jane, look, see Dick, back in this weird world where everybody was like white, this is the 50s, unfortunately. Not only were the politics bad, but the science was bad too. This idea that if a kid just sees a word a whole bunch of time, that they're going to memorize what it looks like. Again, if you go into your kid's classroom, you want to not see a sight word wall with a whole bunch of random words up there. You don't want to see your kid bringing home spelling lists that have words like pumpkin, ghost, goblin, October. These are sort of, again, based on the idea that you see a word and that's how you learn to read it. Well, let's talk about how you actually learn to read now. How do we teach that? What teachers are doing when they're creating that information superhighway in the left-hand side of the brain is they are applying what Seidenberg and McClellan discovered back in 1989. Again, this is super retro, 1989. We've known about this. What teachers are doing is they are teaching kids to become sensitized to patterns in sounds, the sounds of our spoken language. A deaf and hard of hearing kids is sort of another topic. I don't want to completely leave it out, but it's so complicated that I can't really do it justice here. But for kids who hear, or kids who have some level of hearing, maybe they have a cochlear implant, they may be hard of hearing, but have just enough hearing capacity that they can access, spoken sounds and phonics. For these kids, they need to become sensitized to patterns in our spoken language. Great example of this, the fat cat sat on the mat, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, or any number of songs that kids learn and memorize. We're sensitizing kids to how do the sounds fit together to make meaning in our language. That's this part of the brain right here, the speech language part, coincidentally, right behind your ear, where you process all of that phonological information that comes in. And remember, it has to get hooked up to the information that's coming in from your visual processing centers. We call that orthography. Orthography literally means straight spelling. What it means is the visual information on the page. The words, the word pieces, the spacing in between words, the punctuation conventions, a question mark, all of that is part of the visual cueing that when we understand how the sounds work and we understand how all of the language is visually represented on the page, these things come together and get us to semantics. And semantics means meaning. Let me show you this another way. Oh, got rid of my old slide. So the important thing really is that, again, we have to have that bridge between the speech sounds and what the words look like on the page. The brain's got to build that information superhighway. For a lot of our kids, we're teaching them a little bit about how speech sounds fit together and how word patterns work. And we're teaching them a little bit about how to spell and how we can change words by like saying and adding an ED on the end or an IE, ING on the end, or the prefix like PRE in the beginning, prefix. The problem is that we stop teaching all of this information from phonics and orthography that we need to get to meaning. We stop teaching it way too soon. We usually stop teaching kids how to read kind of at the end of second grade. And this doesn't work because English is complicated. This is what we call a deep orthography. English has a lot of rules to learn, and kids, remember, their brains aren't going to rewire unless they get a lot of exposure to these patterns, until they learn to manipulate these patterns and really understand them, until they become completely second nature. This is the phonological awareness continuum. Phonological awareness is how you make sense of the speech stream. And when you're listening to me, my speech is, you understand it pretty well, but it's really a mess. I mean, my Maryland accent notwithstanding, the speech stream is very hard to interpret. We co-articulate, we slur, we pronounce different sounds differently, whether depending on where they appear in the sentence. For example, let's take the word what. For example, no, that's W-H-A-T. But in Maryland, we say things like, what do you want for dinner? That's like a Maryland accent right there. What do you want for dinner? There's no T sound there. You know, there's no t, no nice crisp t at the end of the word what. You know, what do you want for dinner? But somehow babies learn to figure out how to interpret the speech stream. And that is phonological processing. What we need for kids to be able to read is for them to understand how speech sounds go together to make words. That's our phonemic awareness. And the process is going all the way from rhyming, you know, the fat cat sat on the mat, alliteration, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, and then you go up this little cognitive staircase of skills. And at the very top is when you get mature phonemic awareness. That's when kids really understand how speech sounds are represented in words so that they can decode, sound words out, and encode. Encoding is otherwise known as spelling. The problem is a lot of kids don't get up to that highest step in the staircase until about fourth grade. And so this is why we have a lot of kids who they get sort of part of the way there in first and second grade, but then we stop helping them. We just sort of expect them to know it. And so what do? We have the first couple years of elementary school are they learn to read years. And then for these poor kids, we turn the tables on them in third grade and we say, oh, okay, we're done with the learning to read. We are now in the reading to learn phase. And we start sticking textbooks and chapter books and websites and articles in front of these kids and expect them to be able to read them. Well, is it any wonder that our reading scores have us at about 30% proficiency, and the epidemic of low literacy is something that is a problem all across our country? This is just showing you again that teachers really do rewire the brain. This is a 10-year-old who's rhyming, and the blue and the yellow, those are fasciculi, and fasciculi are basically bridges where information can shoot along that information superhighway. You can see how they're kind of going from the back of the brain all the way up to the front, to the speech areas. Again, the brain's not going to invest a lot of energy in developing these superhighways, these expensive, complicated information superhighways, unless it's really been sensitized to patterns that it understands and practices and gets a lot of error correction. So early red flags for dyslexia. One of the big things is a family history of reading problems. Dyslexia does run in families. It's not quite as heritable as some of the really scary things out there, but generally the first question a person like me wants to know is there a family history of reading problems, or did someone in the family have a lot of trouble acquiring language? We want to know if this kid has speech language delays. And that means that our speech language pathologists are really at the very front lines. They are the ones who are likely to be the very first ones to see if a kid is having trouble making sense of the speech stream or making statements and communications as well as they should be. Problems rhyming are something you're going to see early on. Little kids love rhymes. They love silly songs. They like books with rhyming. They love wordplay. They love all kinds of silly stuff with words. If you have a kid who is just sort of not getting that or not taking a lot of pleasure in it, that can be one of your first red flags. And again, of course, our understanding how the speech sounds fit together depends on how well we can hear and how well we can process auditory information. If you're having trouble hearing the difference between an R and a W and an L, for example, whether you've come from this country or from a country with a tonal language, that's going to make it really hard for you to understand when the teacher starts associating letter-sound relationships. Again, pattern sensitization. For all of you teachers out there, Louisa Cook Moats has written this fantastic book, and it is called Speech to Text. It's very teacher friendly. It's a nice big book, nice big print for those of us with middle-aged eyeballs. And what she said is that the most critical, and let me move my big face down so I'm not blocking her. There we go. One of the most critical and least practiced component of effective early instruction is phoneme awareness, that sensitizing kids to the patterns of how word sounds fit together to create meaning. Awareness of the sounds that make up spoken words, facility at manipulating those sounds, and that link between speech and print. Remember, we had phonology, we had orthography, and they got to come together for there to be meaning. This is how we have to this is what we need to do to get kids to be both fluent readers and accurate spellers. All right, now I lost my cursor. The alphabetic principle is an insight that should occur for kids very early on. Remember I said that reading is not about just memorizing how words look. The alphabetic principle is, according to David Kilpatrick, it is an insight. And that insight is that our spoken English, our code is, I jumped the gun, that our written language, that orthography, that straight spelling is actually a code that represents the speech sounds that we say when we talk. So that the insight that the characters on the page represent the segmented phonemes, the speech sounds that make each word unique. Every little child who has adequate hearing can hear the difference between pet and pat and tap, even though those have pretty much the exact same sounds in them. What we need to start with kids, once they've understood the discrimination between sounds, is then we need to say, okay, child, you know a lot about how speech sounds. Now, guess what? You need to start connecting those speech sounds up with these symbols on the page. And that is the alphabetic principle. If you've got a kid in first grade who doesn't seem to be getting that or doesn't seem to be hooking up speech sounds with their graphic representation on the page, that's when it's a great time to make a referral to either the speech pathologist or the school psychologist. Remember I said that we don't learn to read by memorizing how words look. If that was true, none of us would be able to read all of these fonts. And we would find that the deaf and hard of hearing population would not really have a problem learning to read. And we know that for them, it is very hard to learn to read, and low literacy is a big problem among the deaf community, in part because they're often not getting the adequate services that we should be giving them as part of their right to a free and appropriate public education. But people who have either low vision or no vision, they don't have struggles learning to read, again, because it's not a visual memorization task. It is a paired association task. We're pairing up the sound with the graphic representation. Remember, Seidenberg and McClellan discovered this in 1989, that connection between the orthography, the visual piece. Here's the word boy, B-O-Y. It's got two phonemes, b-oy. And then we have the phonology. This bit of gibberish here at the bottom is what the phonological alphabet representation for those two speech sounds, boy. And then at the top you have meaning, and it's a cute little boy like my son used to be before he got all big and hairy. Okay. Your brain gets excited again when it sees patterns. All of you took your brain and looked at these two pictures, and the right-hand picture, if you are a literate person who understands the code of English, the right-hand side activated the reading centers in your brain, and you read the word without any conscious attention. You read it instantly. You read it without even realizing you read it. But nobody looked at the one on the left-hand side because in the English orthography, RFKL cannot be a word. There's no vowels in it, and there's none of these letters can do double duty as a vowel. Remember, we're talking about sensitizing a brain to patterns so that that little brain gets excited and starts connecting up information in ways that will be very robust. This is where it kind of all comes together. Linnea Airy originated the theory of orthographic mapping. Remember, orthography is the text you see on the page. Phonology is the speech sounds that fit together to make words, and all of that goes together to make meaning. What Linnea Airy figured out was that what we're doing when we read is we see sequences of letters, and our reading brain's information superhighway automatically maps the speech sounds onto that sequence of letters. So every single one of you could read the word mapping and know how to pronounce it. You might even hear it in your mind as you read it. And little kids, when they're first starting this process, you'll hear them when they read aloud, and then it gets quieter. And then you sort of, can hear them whispering, but eventually their brain gets so good at this that it goes, we call it goes underground. And that's when they're reading silently to themselves, and they can read faster silently than they can out loud. Orthographic mapping has been making sight word acquisition and comprehension possible for over 2,000 years of human civilization. We love orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping is the reason why Wheel of Fortune and crossword puzzles and Hangman and Scrabble and Words Your Way, that's why they're popular, because we love it. It excites these patterns in our brain. Now, if I showed this to a middle school classroom of, let's say, 7th grade boys, they're probably going to ask to buy a tea. Most of us would immediately think of buying a tea and then think, uh-oh, can't say that out loud. The answer to the puzzle is big tips with a P. But statistically speaking, that word right there is just as likely to have a T as it is likely to have a P. Why do we know that? Because we know patterns, and it's patterns that make us efficient, fast, fluent readers. As kids move on, we're talking about like 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade now. What are we seeing for the red flags? We're seeing problems connecting letters up with sounds. Remember that alphabetic principle, that insight that letters and sounds go together. For most kids, they can get those connections in about 1 to 4 exposures. We also get kids who do not recognize sight words consistently. Now, remember I said that reading is not about memorizing how sight words look. It's about orthographic mapping. When the brain can automatically map the speech sounds onto the written word, that's when reading becomes really automatic and effortless. That's when we can comprehend. For our kids with dyslexia, the patterns get lost. You'll see them reading, like at the top of the page, they may come across the word iceberg, and they'll sound it out maybe or get some help in prompting, but then they may see the word iceberg later down on that same page and not recognize it. You have to keep in mind that once kids are in like 4th, 5th grade and up, they can acquire new sight words with 1 to 4 exposures. That's almost nothing. Our dyslexic kids may need 50 exposures to acquire a new sight word because their brain just isn't locking into the patterns. And so for our dyslexic kids, they are running uphill with a backpack full of cinder blocks trying to get the sight word vocabulary that they need to be able to read grade level text. A big red flag is guessing. Kids are guessing when they cannot decode. Proficient readers decode. Proficient readers are capable of letter sound relationships. They're capable of orthographic mapping. They understand the rules for how words are spelled. Kids who have no idea what the patterns are telling them are guessing. We should not be teaching kids to guess. We also have to watch out for our gifted kids. They will rely on memory, and so they'll fool us. A lot of our gifted kids or our really savvy kids, they will find all sorts of tricks to cover up the fact that they are not reading. They memorize, they look up information on Spark Notes, they may refuse to read, they may say, I don't like it, it's stupid, why do you want me to do this? But they're going to cover up the fact that they're really not decoding well enough, again, to extract information from text. There was an argument that we needed to get rid of phonics because phonics was just too complicated, that all of English had so many complicated spellings that there was just no way that kids could ever learn how to decode all of English. Well, this isn't really true. This is a myth that I grew up hearing. And what I've learned as I've done more research is that all of us who are proficient readers, we know so much about the patterns of English, and we don't even think about it anymore because our brain has made it unconscious for us. We're so good at it, we don't even think about it. Well, let me sensitize you to a couple patterns and see for yourself if this is really this inscrutable code that nobody could ever figure out. Okay, take a look at the orange block in the upper left-hand corner. I want you to know we have 5 letters designated as vowels, but we have 18 vowel sounds in English. So we have A, E, I, O, U. That's not enough, right? Because we also have things like Y that can function as vowels or O, U, G, H that can function as vowels. The A is tricky. We have different vowel sounds here represented by the A. Say it out loud to yourself. No, don't worry, nobody's watching. All, are, 8, apartment, and apple. That's a letter A. This should not be up on your word wall as the letter A. Why? Because these are all different sounds. These are different phonemes. We've all, are, 8, apartment, that's that schwa, and apple, the long A. So what we should have up on the wall are sound boards, not or sound walls, not word walls, because if we have word walls, that really doesn't help because that letter could say a whole bunch of different sounds. We have tricky things, like if you move your attention down to the yellow square, we have laughter and daughter. This could be an argument for, oh my gosh, English is so inscrutable. It's so complicated. We will never figure out how to decode all of these. But if you have an extra piece of information about English orthography patterns, you know that the GH in the middle of a word can sometimes make the F sound. And it can sometimes, only in the middle of the word, function as a vowel sound. So the beginning one, we could try it as laughter. Well, that doesn't work. Let's try the F sound. Okay, let's try reading that GH as F, laughter. Ah, there we go, that's a word. And now for daughter, if I know that GH can function as a vowel, if it's in the middle of the word, I'm going to try my vowel sound there, and then I can read daughter. This isn't complicated. You do have words where you just have to know. So if you look at the green square, and I'm going to move my little panel of faces again, we have tear, live, and bow, or do we? We might also have tear, live, and bow. Ooh. So we have words where the spelling is exactly the same, but we have to orthographically map different speech sounds onto those. If we know these about these words and we see it in context, it becomes really very simple. Nobody says like, I want to live in PG County, right? They don't say, I'm going to tear up my paper or anything else. If you look in the upper right, we have one of the canonical examples for why people say that phonics is too complicated. The gray square, we have plow, trough, and dough. Again, that O-U-G-H sound is making 3 different phonemes. Oh my gosh, we have ow and off and oh my gosh. But if you know that, if you know that when you come across a word with the O-U-G-H sound, you've got to try one of 3 sounds in order to get the word right, you know what to do and you can crack that code. We also have some digraphs like the TH. Digraph is when you've got basically a partnership between two letters to represent one speech sound. But the neat thing about this and thistle is that the only difference here is that in this, the TH is voiced. So if you put your hand on your throat and you say this and then thistle, you'll feel that your vocal cords are only working with this. Thistle is all about spitting through your teeth. And then we have other words where the position of the letter, like in yes and stay, determines whether or not it functions as a vowel. Kids can learn this. We can sensitize kids to these patterns if we put enough time and energy into it during those early years of elementary school and don't stop until they get to 4th grade. Again, we got a lot of patterns in English that we can teach kids without too much of a struggle. Imagine if all of our struggling readers were taught just this bit, that there are 6 syllable types. I never learned this in grad school. It's 6 years of special education degree. Nobody taught me this. There are 6 syllable types. And if kids even just understand the difference between a closed and an open syllable, closed is when you have like ball and cat. Open is when you have, closed is when you have a short vowel sound. Open is when you have the long, the vowel can say its name like typo. If you can just teach kids the difference between a closed and an open syllable, this cracks open thousands of words that they can now read in English. The consonants are easy, right? When we say consonants, our mouths are doing a lot of stuff. You know, the, thistle, top, put, but it's the vowels where it's much more subtle. If you try pronouncing all of the English vowel sounds, you can do it like this. Isn't that awesome? But when you do that, feel how your mouth really isn't changing much at all. You're just very subtly manipulating the speech stream. But again, if we give kids these handy little tools for cracking that code and understanding the patterns, this is when things get better. And this is exactly what our dyslexic kids need, because their brains are not snowballing by recognizing pattern upon pattern upon pattern. They're not making good predictions. They're guessing, they're struggling, they're avoiding. We can crack this code for them by this kind of remediation where we just teach them, hey, guess what? This is how it works. Remember, proficient readers decode, struggling readers guess. So English orthography actually has a method in the madness. It was designed to convey meaning. And by English orthography, I mean how stuff is spelled. I don't know about you, but I'm a terrible speller. Absolutely hated it. We spent all of elementary school memorizing these random lists of words. And when you teach kids to memorize random lists of words, that's not patterns. Brains don't hold on to random lists of words. Brains hold on to patterns. So in our orthography, our spelling actually gives us a lot of cues about both meaning and pronunciation. Particular spellings in English are reserved for particular meanings. And when these conflict, as Kathy Rassel says, the spelling gets tanked in favor of meaning. So here's just one example, like picked and flipped. If you say those words to yourself, picked, flipped, there's no T in there. And yet you will end them with that T sound. That ed suffix tells you that this is a past tense verb. Whereas if you come across a word like wrapped or worst, you make the same sound with your mouth at the end of the word, but these are adjectives. So an adjective can end in a T, but not a past tense verb. It's not going to end in a T, in an ed. It's going to end with a T sound, but be spelled with the ed. Ditto with things like butcher, baker, candlestick maker. That ER on the end gives us meaning. So that little suffix of ER tells you this is somebody that does or makes something. Ditto with like magic is done by a magician. Psychology can be practiced by a psychologist. And then of course we have our bound morphemes at the end of a verb like bake. You got bake, bakes, baked, baking. And that tells us, of course, the verb conjugation. As kids who do not have reading problems advance, what happens is their reading snowballs. And what I mean by that is you see them go from this effortful, labor-intensive decoding, where they're trying to decode every single phoneme in a word. K, at, k, at, k, cat, 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 cat. And then maybe 10 tries later, they finally get to cat. What David Scher figured out is that signal that the brain is rewiring, that it's building that information superhighway, is the brain starts to teach itself. Brains recognize patterns, and the better your brain gets at recognizing patterns, the faster and faster and faster your sight word bank develops, not because you're memorizing what the word looks like, but because your orthographic mapping has gotten so incredibly efficient that you can map speech sounds onto a new word. You know so much about how words are spelled and pronounced and the meaning that your brain just takes off. And this is when we see kids go from reading things like Hop on Pop to maybe Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or The Snowy Day or that beautiful literature that we want them to access. Some later red flags. One of the things I will see a lot in dyslexic kids who have somehow managed to skate under the wire or never been identified as a kid with a reading disorder is that their reading is slow and labored. These kids hate reading out loud for me. When they read out loud, they will kind of struggle, they'll guess, they'll also slur their words or sort of fudge and skip around a little bit. Most of the time, we're not asking kids to read aloud very much after the second grade, again, because, you know, we've sort of like, okay, we've taught them how to read. It's really important for teachers to listen to their kids read and watch what they're doing. Watch and see if they're just sort of fudging it, or if maybe they heard the other kid read the not Orton Gillingham, if they heard the other kid read the Fontes and Pinnell passage and it's called like the loose tooth, and then they come and make up a bunch of stuff about the loose tooth. We also see our dyslexic kids may be able to decode a bit, may recognize some sight words, but it's still so hard for them that they're reading without comprehending. Our brains have very little bandwidth. We think we can do a whole bunch of stuff like drive and text at the same time. We really can't. So when a kid's energy is all devoted to decoding and orthographic mapping, there's nothing left for comprehension. Also avoidance, especially our boys, and I have 3 boys. I'm not trying to hate on boys, but a lot of boys get really embarrassed when they can't read. And rather than look stupid, they will make some trouble or get up out of their seat or disrupt the class. The number one reason kids get referred to special education is not for learning problems, it's for behavior problems. We also have the resistance to reading. In this country, we have a whole PR campaign. Reading is fun. Reading is fundamental. Look at all these celebrities and posters reading. Reading's so fun for all of us who can read well. But reading is not fun if you can't read well. If reading is embarrassing and a lot of hard work, and you don't read well enough to enjoy the story, you're so focused on how hard it is to just decode, why on earth would you want to do it? And we keep telling kids how important it is. They all know how important it is to read. They all know how much we want them to do it. But again, if they're having the experience of reading being like trying to run uphill with a backpack full of cinder blocks, we really can't blame them because they don't want to do it. Remember I said that brains have very little bandwidth. For our dyslexic kids and our kids who are struggling readers, they, again, are so slow when they're reading that there's no brain bandwidth left for comprehension, because decoding and language comprehension, remember the simple view of reading, this is how we get to reading comprehension. The fluent comprehending reader's brain gets the best gift of ever, and that is the time to process the information of the text. Proficient readers also monitor and repair their comprehension. If you have a dyslexic kid, you will see that they make mistakes, but don't recognize that they've made mistakes. Kids with ADHD do this too. They will not monitor their comprehension. They're doing surface reading, or else they are so engaged in decoding that they don't notice when they've read a sign like this. Becoming a vegetarian is a big mistake. If you're monitoring your comprehension, you know why this is This is like one of those funny little road signs. The problem is, of course, that a lot of our kids who are stuck in that sort of low literacy purgatory, they don't get the skills, instruction that they need to get to the reading for meaning payoff, as Dr. Timothy Shanahan calls it. You'll also see that when a struggling reader is reading, their eyes are going all over the page. Well, guess what? Proficient readers' eyes are also going all over the page because we are making a lot of predictions and we're constantly monitoring our comprehension. This is not a sign of an ocular motor problem. This does not mean that a dyslexic kid who has a neurological difficulty needs vision therapy. They don't. A kid with an actual or ocular motor problem needs vision therapy, but you don't treat dyslexia with vision therapy because, again, it's not a visual motor task. Can we comprehend without understanding? I think all the teachers here tonight would say absolutely. How many kids do we see who can get through a comprehension test without understanding anything about what they just read? Here's an example. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves and the mome raths outgrabe. This is a famous nonsense poem from Alice in Wonderland. Now, if I gave you a comprehension test and I said, okay, when was this story set? You would say, brillig. What were the slithy toves doing? They were gyring and gimbling where were they gyring and gimbling? In the wabe. So if you give a kid a performance-based assessment that asks them to sort of go back in the text and just pull out the information and plug it in, and you think that you've really assessed reading comprehension, you're going to have a kid who is going to skate by and never get the services and the intervention that they actually need. When I was taught way back in the 90s, I was taught that the way to teach kids reading comprehension was to teach them comprehension strategies. Well, the research has caught up. That's not how we do it. You can teach them some comprehension strategies, such as how to, look for the words in bold and understand text features later. The most important thing that improves a kid's ability to comprehend is vocabulary. And not only vocabulary, but background knowledge. So for example, if you have a kid who is new to this country and they don't know things like what Americans consider bread looks like, even for example, if you're from Afghanistan, bread is a really flat, kind of grayish brown dish that, you just tear off little bits of. It's not this big puffed up sliced thing like most Americans would think of. So we have to give kids vocabulary and we have to give them the background information. Again, brains don't hold on to information that doesn't make any sense to us. So if we can pre-teach vocabulary, teach the vocabulary in context, and most of all, give these kids the background information. We don't have to do a huge unit on the background information before we read anything, but sensitizing kids to, hey, this story is set in a desert. What do we know about deserts? What do we want to learn about deserts? What do we know about a desert? Just that little moment of activating their background knowledge can make all the difference. And then, okay, we're going to read a story about a desert. Let's memorize some words like mesa, for example, or camel, or whatever it is you might find in that desert. If we pre-teach the vocabulary, then the kids can comprehend. If you don't know vocabulary words, or if you can't decode a word, your comprehension of text, you're going to miss about 10 to 40% of words if you're just trying to guess, and that leaves you at the frustration level. Here's another example of reading comprehension and how kids can fool you. Everybody take a look at this list. We have the words greedy, error, elements, data, training, depending, quadruple, sequence, transformation, minimize, decision, attachment, and rule. Now, most of you in this room read most of these words with really no problem. These are fairly high frequency words that most of us will come across at some point. So somebody's mic is on. So these are words that most people read. Now, just because you know these words, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to read everything that has these words. Let me show you an example. Brill and Resnik used 12,000 training and 500 test samples. A greedy search is used to learn a sequence of transformations which minimize the error rate on training data. A transformation is a rule which makes an attachment decision depending on up to 3 elements of the quadruple. I want to say I'm so sorry to our wonderful interpreters tonight, because that was kind of really mean to give you that. The point of this is that you knew these words, right? But does that mean that you could understand this? And no, most of us can't. I couldn't before I married a computer scientist. The Resnik in here is not me. It's my husband, Dr. Philip Resnik, and his friend, the good Dr. Brill. Even though I know the words, if I don't have the background information to understand that they're talking about computational linguistics and programming a computer to understand text, I can read this and I can answer comprehension questions about it well enough probably to pass my state assessment. But am I going to learn this and know it and then be able to use that information later on? Absolutely not. So what works? What works to both prevent and treat dyslexia? Systematic instruction in letter sound skills, phonemic awareness, that's understanding how speech sounds fit together to make words, phonemic blending and analysis. This is going from k, a, t to cat, and then being able to take the AT and put the word p, or put the p sound in front of it. And then instead of cat, I have pat. We refer to this as phonemic manipulation and transposition. That phonemic blending and analysis is like our holy grail. That's where we've got to get these kids before 4th grade in order for them to be able to hit the read to learn years and actually have a snowball's chance in where of being able to make progress. Early spelling instruction that is sensitizing kids to patterns in the orthography, rules in the orthography. When I was back in grad school, they told us that spelling didn't matter, that kids were going to use invented spelling, and then the more exposure they got to text, the more the spelling would just naturally arrive. And if it didn't, who cared anyway, right? Well, guess what? The research tells us that being able to go from decoding to encoding, that's spelling, and back again, this is how we get that brain truly sensitized to make that connection between the visual information and the auditory information in a way that the brain can really hold on to and make that information superhighway. And of course, teacher has to be an activator, not a facilitator. We must teach kids how to crack this code. We have to teach them the rules for decoding, and we can't just teach it, one and done, 10 minutes a day. They have to have this experience multiple times a day, because again, kids can only focus for about a 20-minute lesson. What I'm doing now is pedagogically completely indefensible. I've been lecturing you for the better part of an hour. But that explicit teaching of decoding, things like the 6-syllable types, things like voiced and unvoiced sounds, things like digraphs, things like where a Y has to be in order to make a vowel sound. These rules have to be taught and taught and taught in different situations, with different books, with different activities. That's how we convince that cheap, lazy little brain that it has to rewire and build that information superhighway. So here's what I want to leave you with. In terms of advocacy, I see a lot of parents who were told that their kid does not have a reading problem, or that we should just wait and see. It's too early to do anything. Let's just wait and see. Imagine if your doctor told you that when you were pretty sure that your son had broken his leg. Well, let's just wait and see. He's a boy. Our boys and our kids of color especially, parents, this, your kids are much more likely to hear, oh, he's just a boy, or, oh, let's just wait and see. That curse of low expectations comes back to bite us every generation. We can do better. Do not accept just let's wait and see, especially if you are seeing these red flags. Get your kid in front of a speech pathologist, get the team to meet, get the school psychologist in the mix. Start educating yourself like what you did tonight. Response to intervention is a great way to get kids access to evidence-based reading intervention without waiting for them to get an IEP. But we wait too long. We wait and do response to intervention for a very long time before we recognize, like, wait a minute, we need more information. We got to test this kid. Doing RTI does not mean we don't test a kid. It doesn't mean we don't provide services like ESOL or special education and such when the kid needs it. It is not, we do RTI and that's all we do, even though Maryland is an RTI state. Advocate for intensive phonics in small groups. Push in, okay, that's fine. If you have somebody pushing into the classroom to teach your kid phonics, but if your kid has problems paying attention or focusing, you need pullout. That kid needs to be in a small group, in a quiet room where they can really concentrate and focus. Get a meeting of the multidisciplinary team going. These people are here to help you. Unfortunately, we often see that there's like an adversarial relationship between parents and teachers. And that makes sense because there's only so much to go around and teachers are under a lot of pressure, administrators, a lot of pressure. But get those people in the room, get everybody talking about what you're seeing, help them understand what you're seeing at home, because what you're seeing at home may be something they never see in the classroom because they got 30 kids. And of course, if your kid gets testing and is found to have a reading problem, a speech language problem, a dysgraphia, dyslexia, this is the time when we get the IEP in place sooner rather than later. And of course, there is power in numbers. There's power when a whole bunch of parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all the rest of the caring people band together. There's organizations like the International Dyslexia Association, the Reading League, the Learning Disabilities Association. PG County has this wonderful program where they're providing you with information. Get together with those other parents because that's when we get the real powerful things like laws in the state of Maryland where every child has to be screened for dyslexia. The power comes in numbers. I admit it, I read that in Morgan Freeman's beautiful voice. Thank you all so much for coming. If you want me to hang out